So I advise a lot of junior faculty on K Awards, and this is always the conference that I tell people, or workshop that they must attend if they're going to actually get good network training, because all the people who come back from it are always like, oh wow, I got really good training here, and now I know how to do this stuff. So just sort of, what I want to do really is sort of take the conversations from yesterday and earlier today and sort of try to go through them, because Tom gave just a fantastic summary of all network and influence and peer influence models, so I don't want to be too redundant. So I'm going to take some materials that people have talked about and try to bring some of them forward, as well as talk about some of the work we do. This is going to be sacrilege. I'm not going to present a visual, a network diagram today, because you guys would put me to shame. But just continuing the conversations on manuscripts, I purposely send my colleagues and students crappy manuscripts to review, because I want them to see that I'm at this stage, and if somebody sends me something that's like they're ready to ship it out the door, what use am I? Especially if I'm like, well, maybe you should do something different, because then you get lots of resistance of, oh, I put all this time into it, and now you're telling me to change it. So don't be modest. Share with people your drafts of really early on manuscripts, rather than waiting until you think you have something perfect. How I got into network field? Well, I sort of somehow got to Baltimore. I'm not sure how. I took the wrong turn somewhere on some interstate. And I was going out with health educators for HIV into the community. And this was for people who injected drugs. And the peer educators, you'd go out there and there was a community. People know everybody. You could go and talk to your neighborhood drug dealer with their wads of $10s or $20 bills. You'd sort of get a sense, and you hear about how people would use drugs, and you talk to people, and it was a social behavior. And then you'd come into the public health sterile conditions, and they would treat people like individuals, and they would tell them educationally, oh, don't share needles. And people would nod politely and say, oh, thank you for sharing this information for me, but it probably had very little impact on their behaviors, but everybody felt good. Oh, we gave this intervention to these folks, and now everything's fine. So I've been focusing on network interventions. So when you do interventions, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. So what I would suggest, if you do an intervention, collect data. So I'll give a slide on that. But so fast forward from my first coming to Baltimore about a decade later, and we were doing a sea pool intervention in Chennai, India, where what we do is we first found that men who had HIV, they used alcohol a fair amount. And then we found, well, people go to loosely called wine shops, which were illicit hole-in-the-wall places where they would sell wine, or what was wine, wine was like, it's a very loose term for wine, but the beer was good. Anyway, so they'd have these little places where people could gather behind the wine shops, near the wine shops, and men would go there and drink, and then they would go in groups often to commercial sex workers. So it's like, oh wow, this is the perfect place for a CPOL intervention, a community popular opinion leader intervention. So we did our due diligence, and we mapped out 20 areas of the city, because Chennai's a big city. The areas had to be a couple miles apart, and half of them were control clusters of wine shops, and half of them were experimental. And we used ethnographers, we used the people in the wine shop to identify the opinion leaders. They seemed like very stable networks. So we did our intervention. The participants, the CPOLs, took it very seriously. They were gung-ho about it. They thought this was a real risk HIV. They wanted to do something about it. So we trained them, and then we did serial cross-sectional assessments between the two groups. So, and this was an expensive intervention. So we did everything right in Cadillac, RTC, cluster randomized design. And then we analyzed the data, and guess what? No difference between experimental and control group. So it's like, okay, what's going on? And I think that's the thing about interventions. There's a lot of things to go wrong. So what we did afterwards was we interviewed folks about their behaviors and everything, and the CPOLs were like, yeah, I really went out, man. I talked to all these people, and yeah. And then we asked them where they talked to the people. Well, in the wine shops. It's like, well, which ones? And what we had done was mapped out all the wine shops they went to after work in the evenings. All the ones that they went to after their jobs. But a lot of people's jobs were not like 9 to 5. So they went to different wine shops in the mornings. They went to different wine shops on the weekends. And if you looked at where the control groups were, they often went to those wine shops. So there was massive contamination. So one thing, if you have the best intervention in the world, you will have no difference between your experimental and your control group. Because you'll have massive diffusion, which is another word for contamination. So just to give an example of, you can do a really high quality intervention, but sometimes your public health impact may be in the opposite of what you think is your scientific impact. So I think that just gives you a sense of, when you're doing interventions, some of the things that can impact what you're finding. So now, I wanted to just, this is sort of, I pulled this more towards the front of the presentation, thinking about, okay, how do you get good network data? And I think, some of us here who've looked at network data over the years, when you get bad network, like how do you know if you have bad network data? How do you know if your network data is golden, or how do you know if it just sucks? You have data. Do you have some reliability measure? No. So one thing you have to really do is strive to get your best network data. And bad network data is like, I don't know, like something in your refrigerator that's kind of old. You hate to throw it out. You try to nuke it in the microwave, and you think, oh, maybe this, and it just doesn't work. And then you take and you're like, okay, well, maybe I won't look at, degree. I'll look for a proportion of networks who do this or that. And you play with it. It's like you get, maybe there's something there. And then you send it to a journal, and then poor Tom is like, oh, what do I do with this? And the reviewers are like, So one thing to think about before you start this is, how do you maximize getting good quality network data? And one thing to think about is, why should people give you good network data? What's in it for them? So we're gung-ho about like, oh, this is a really cool study. People are going to love it. But you need to think the flip side. Why should participants think about this is something that they really want to give you high quality data? Why should they trust you? What are you going to do with this data? So I think thinking about those things. Other things is interviewers who administer network surveys, whether it's paper or whether they're working with somebody on a tablet, tend to have set points where they think, oh, you gave me 5 names. Well, that's cool, that's good. And another interviewer might be, oh, you gave me 20 names. Well, that's what I expect. So you really need to sort of get that early network data if you have different interviewers, seeing how many names they're generating, and then really try to give them feedback on what you really expect. Because if you don't have expectations, you probably won't get people to give you a lot of names. So you also want to structure an interview too, where never ever have your network inventory at your last part of a study visit. Because people just want to get the hell out of there. And at that time, they have no friends, no sex partners, and don't do drugs. And they get out of there quickly. So really think about where you put your network inventory or how you're assessing it. Yesterday was talk about how many name generators. So you're gonna get to a point of diminishing returns with any network generator. And you may think, oh, I've got this really great network inventory or name generator question. I'll put it first. And you're like, oh, wow, that's great. I got 5 names out of it. But if you had put that same network name generator last, you would have probably gotten 1, maybe at the most, because you just get that curve. So you really want to think about how many name generators you really want to include in your network inventory. And part of that is just multiplexity, because people usually have more than one relationship, one role. So every name generator often isn't getting a new group. It's getting some of the old group and getting some new groups. But I think that's some things to think about as well. And then finally, network canvas. People like it. I should say I have a conflict of interest because I've worked with those folks for about a decade, and they're a super wonderful group to work with. But there's people, if you ask somebody how long it takes them to fill out a network canvas survey versus a pencil and paper survey, they'll say about half as long, because it's just a more enjoyable experience. And I guess finally on the network part, always just first have the name generators. Don't ask a name generator question and then ask for relationship questions, because then people say, oh my gosh, the more names I give, then they're going to ask me all these questions. So definitely do the name generators first. If you get good network data, you can publish a lot. And this is really important for interventions, because with an intervention, you're basically saying, I'm going to have 1 paper out of this. I'm going to have the outcome paper. So I think if you get really good network data and you have, and this also goes back to the prior conversation about publishing. You can publish a lot of papers if you have good network data, but there's some other things. So since you don't know, nobody can say you have a good network inventory, because there's just no gold standards. It can be beneficial to put in your surveys things which there are, that's a tried and true measure that has, rigorous measures of reliability and validity. We always use like a measure of depression or something like that. So when the reviewers, you can say, oh, I have this scale that has these rigorous aspects, and then I also have my network measure too, because in some fields they really care about that sort of things. What also think about when you collect data is which data is really you think you need, but you're never going to analyze. And things that you might, I always find things like intentions or self-efficacy. There's often a ceiling effect. People over-report those. And also, I'm not really interested in that to a great degree, because, it's just, I don't know, it's not very fascinating for me to work on those types of theories. For interventions, it can be difficult to recruit individuals. So one thing I always hear about people say, oh, you can't get the network people. We got these individuals, these index, but they're having a hard time getting their networks in. So I've seen a lot of studies where that they recruit one individual and ask them to bring in their networks, and they can't. So think about how you can work with networks, how you can problem solve with networks, how you can recontact them to bring in these networks. So set up a study, not assuming that people are going to have an easy time bringing in their personal networks or going a couple steps out. And think about how you can help them bring in those network members. But the nice thing about if you get network members in of what we call index individuals, they're alters really. If you get indexes to bring in their alters, when you do retention, when you're following up people, it's a lot easier to have high levels of retention because you can continue to get the people to come back in through their networks. I think when you collect network data for interventions, you really want to see who they're going to, you want to bring in the people they're going to have the potential to influence. So you don't want to just list all the people. For us, it's your drug network. You want to have something like the frequency of contact, that they have to contact the person at least once a week or several times a week. So there's some sort of ability to influence their behaviors. And then finally, I'd say a lot of our work is personal, egocentric networks, but collect that data in a way that you can build a sociocentric network from it. Think about what data you would really need for matching to make a larger network from your ego or personal networks. I think that's in the past that's been time consuming, but I can't see any reason you can't use your friendly neighborhood AI program to do that matching and come up and develop your sociocentric network. So when you're thinking even for the personal networks, think down the road that you could use this data for developing larger networks. Any questions so far? Okay, let me go on my pet peeves, which usually you put at the end in your conclusion, but I'll bring them in. And this is true for journals as well as network interventions, is you read a journal and it's like, we did this intervention and we got these outcomes. How many times have you read an article where you read the intervention section and you actually know what they did and you can replicate that? It drives me like, oh, this seems cool. Let me think. It's like there's so little there, and that's sort of our culture of what we do. But it seems like we don't describe those mechanisms of what's going on. We say we did like social cognitive behavioral, but we're not really showing what those pathways are. So if we're not really describing what's in the intervention in such a way, and we're not really measuring that, then we just keep on perpetuating some of our mindless, simplistic behavioral theories, especially in psychology. I can say that because I'm trained in psychology. Another thing is if you go into the lab sciences, they spend so much time on quality control. And you can write papers on Q&A. But with behavioral social sciences, we don't really write a lot about how do you improve self-report. How do you improve the quality of this? And I think some of it is because maybe it would make our own work look suspect. But it's just not as part of the culture of how to improve our measures. And then finally, I'd say, I do lots of social epi studies, but what does that tell me about how to do an intervention? All it says is, yeah, these things are associated. And maybe I'm downplaying that a little bit. But I think you learn a lot more about understanding social environments by trying to change them, from a sort of a systems theory, than just like cross-sectionally look at things that are correlated. And you look at, a field like physics. What does physics do? It takes a little particle and slams it into it, really gets its high speeds and slams it in. I think you learn a lot by, getting people to go out in their social environments. And that's often what we do in network interventions. We ask them to go out, and then we see how people in their environment reacts. We understand some of the barriers for that, as well as what facilitates their behavior. So I think looking at things of not just statically, but how can you do your research and studies to try to change those behaviors or change that social environment and see what happens. And it doesn't take like a whole massive study to do that. You can do a few qualitative interviews and say, hey, can you go out to your friends and tell them this or do this, and then come back and tell me what happens. So I think you can learn a lot about how social environments react by putting people in them and seeing how, when they try to change it, what happens. So I think, others went over how we can do these peer interventions, so I won't dwell on that. But just sort of going into some of the theories of what might be going on or what we try to capitalize on when we do interventions. And part of it is we're really, let me start with the norms, because that's sort of one of the real, I think, emphasis of this presentations is when you talk about something to somebody, you're changing often a norm that makes that now acceptable to talk about it. When you talk about something, you're making it more salient in the environment. So people are like, oh, that's something we should pay attention to. So they think that norm also, they think that is more prevalent. So if somebody is saying, oh, yeah, I'm not going to share needles, or I'm going to carry my naloxone with me, the more, if they talk about it, then people start to think, oh, that's a behavior of this group. So it becomes more seen as a more salient or more important norm in the group. So I think one thing that we really try to do in these interventions is try to make these certain things acceptable to talk about, and then by talking about it, change the norms. But the norms are often contradictory. Somebody doesn't want to share syringes because they don't want to get HCV or HIV, but they're also going through withdrawal symptoms and they want to get their drugs quickly. So it's not like, oh yeah, let's just change our norms and then everything's fine. There's going to be contradictory pressures and attitudes within a group, so you're really pushing against some of those norms that are trying to or lead to risk by making these norms that are leading to risk reduction more prevalent and more salient. So what we often do in these interventions, these peer interventions that I've been a part of, is going to this first part, is we're using more within the small group, social cognitive theory of role-playing, modeling, practicing behaviors to get people to be able to promote these social norms, to be able to then diffuse the information through the groups, through the networks. So another thing we tend to do in our interventions is we make up stuff. And one of the things we make up is social roles. We're like authors of a play. We make up these roles. One of our roles is peer educator. And there's nothing tried and true about you're a peer educator, you do A, B, and C, but we get people to buy into these roles so that we want to make sure that these roles are seen as important to them and relevant to their lives. We want to make sure these roles are something that they get positive feedback from so they maintain these roles in the community. We want to ensure that these roles in a group give them a sense of identity. so that these roles are sustained. And we'll say, hey, if you're a peer educator, you got to be modeling these behaviors. You got to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. So we try to make it, okay, this is what a peer educator does. So we just socially construct these roles of peer educator. And those roles are consistent with two things. One is they're going to promote a health behavior. Another thing is the role is going to be sustained in the community. And part of the way you sustain that is the way they communicate and the way you train them. And one of the things about training people is you want to train them in being very realistic. So it's not, oh, please, would you pass me the Grey Poupon in a clean syringe? It's like, why in the hell should I believe you? I saw you just sharing drugs over there. Now you're telling me you're getting on your high horse and telling me not to do this. It's like, okay, what are you going to do in that situation when you get that? So we try to make our training such that they're going to really, if people challenge them outside, that their role is both flexible enough and they can defend it in such a way that they can maintain that social status of having this role. Because some people may feel threatened by this role or just, want to give people a bad time. So how do you construct a role where people can go out into the community and influence others, and these others are their network members? So we also, when we train them in a group setting, also our group facilitators are giving them positive feedback and giving them what we call homework that they go out in the community and promote in certain health behaviors, but that they're successful. So we structure it in a way that they're always successful. That you can do a little bit or you can do a lot. So we're just trying to develop these social roles de novo that are going to be sustained and are going to promote behavior change. So based on this paradigm, here's a couple things I think is important. So how do these networks work in a way where you're going to find some social influence that's relatively stable? So I think knowing not only who's in their network, what networks are stable, but also what behaviors are correlated within networks. Where does it seem like there is some influence? For example, we don't find that having mom in the network has much influence on your overdose behavior. Sorry, moms. Or dad's useless. But so it's just not a relationship where you find this association. But we do find that if mom is in your network and we follow you for a year, you're a lot less likely to be homeless. So who are those roles? What are their resources that can potentially influence a health behavior that you're concerned about, and that relationship is stable enough? So the second thing is, why should people be in our lame, stupid intervention? Because we're scientists? So why should they do this? So I think you have to give people a reason. In the beginning, it could be an extrinsic reason. It could be, like, why should they trust me? So I give you, 20, 25 bucks to come into our session. But what we try to do is change it from extrinsic motivation to be in the intervention to they've had an experiences where now it's intrinsic. Now they really want to be in it because they're getting positive rewards. It's part of their identity. It's seen as they're doing something useful for the community. So we try to think about, what are the motivations? And then what communication skills do people really need? And you can go off on, communication skills are very difficult. You can go off on lots of them. And people will politely nod their heads. And they'll think it's cool and not remember anything. So what are the basic things that are really critical for people to know that they can learn, that they can actually go out in the community and actually do? And some things we do is we often, we'll say, okay, here's 4 conversation starters that you can start a conversation about overdose prevention. Which ones do you want to choose? And then they choose one, and then, okay, who are you going to talk to? So just giving people simple things about, okay, here's how you can start a conversation. Because it is awkward. Well, why are you talking to me about this? Have you found God or something? This is weird. So you want to give people a reason they're going out and talking to their social network members about this topic. Then I think I also mentioned for often these interventions, we get one individual we call an index and have them recruit their alters. So we also want to really work with them to figure out how to recruit those folks. We'll call them up, help problem solve where they can recruit those network members, bring them in. And then finally, what we do often is they're randomized clinical trials where people are randomized, indexes are randomized, they bring in a network member or 2 or 3. Then once they bring in a network member, they're randomized, and then we do a pre-post and follow people up. I should also say for these types of interventions, for social norms, changes, for these interventions, what we often see is at first the behaviors between the experimental and control, because we often do an equal attention control, both groups go down, say at 6 months. But then what you see is the intervention, the experimental condition, they're continuing to go down more because the messages is being reinforced by people in their network. They've gotten a skill set to reduce those behaviors as well. So there was talk yesterday about, with our networks, what is it? Is it differential affiliation? Do people just hang out together who have the same type of behaviors? Or is it social influence? Or is it both? And one question is, for network interventions, does it matter? If I can rather than are people influencing each other, can I get one of those people to influence the other folks? So I think even if we don't find that there's social influence, we can still train somebody, and with differential affiliation, that's great, because then we can identify high-risk individuals where you can go in and try to change a behavior. So in some ways, yes, it's an important conceptually, but for interventions, both are really valuable ways to go. Another thing, and I think maybe Tom mentioned this or somebody else did, is if you're out there as a peer educator, as our index people, telling other people to change their behavior, you're going to change your behavior. And what we almost always find is the people who change their behavior most are these peer educators, the people that we've trained. And of course, there's lots of reasons for it. They're actively engaged in this. They want to keep their status as peer educators, so they don't want to be seen in the community as not engaging in these things. So you also get the benefit when you're doing these interventions is you're really having a big impact on the peer educators. So our approach to choosing peer educators it's a very rigorous approach that we do, and that is, can you walk into our clinic? Reason for this? Couple things. When we first, we've done certainly CPOL interventions, and like in Chennai, it was easy to identify the opinion leaders. They were consistent from the network point of view, from just observations, that it was very clear. For us working with people who use drugs, when we ask, okay, who's opinion leader, drug dealer, priest, myself, we didn't find any reliability on who people were judging. And the networks were such that we didn't have really time to get large sociometric networks. So when you're dealing with disadvantaged populations, people who have a lot going on, who may or may not be able to maintain your intervention, even with the best of intentions, the goal really is we're training people to be opinion leaders. We're training them knowing that some of them with the best intentions won't be able to do this. But from sort of a population level, if we train enough people, then you'll get enough of these folks to stick with it. Not everybody will. Some people might be incarcerated or move or get sick or other things. But if we train enough people, that we're going to get folks who are going to be effective in this role. So it's more of, okay, can we make these opinion leaders rather than find them in the community? Because we just didn't have any reliable way of finding people. Communication skills. Some of it, again, is not just, our notion of communication is often we'll tell people what to do, which it doesn't work very well. But one of the things often our peer educators do for their networks is they're framing an issue of like, oh my gosh, did you know you could get HIV this way? Or, this is happening. So what they're doing is they're not just giving information, they're framing issues. And we're also training them to do what we did with them. It's like, oh, it's great that, to their network, it's great that you're thinking about these things. Oh, I see now you're taking a small dose of drugs and not using a full syringe to make sure you don't overdose. So we're also training them in ways that promote, they're giving positive feedback to their network members, which tends to be cyclical, or so then their network members want to engage with them more about these topics. There's a quaint little mnemonic that we sometimes train people with. This is your safe skills as a peer educator. S stands for see if it's the right time and place. A is ask questions and listen. F stands for find options and friendly feedback. E stands for encourage others to plan. So peer educators, if you don't train them, tend to be what everybody else does. Think that other people, A, have an information deficit. And if you just tell them, they're going to change their behaviors, which, of course, is not true and can be very obnoxious. So I may have another slide. So yeah, peer educators, just like everybody, have their mental models of how behaviors change. Most often, those mental models are inadequate. So part of it is we're giving them another mental model of how people actually change their behaviors. And we also, like a peer educator, is not judgmental. So again, part of that social role that we're developing so that they can diffuse this behavior change out to their networks. So another thing we try to do is just think of things that they can discuss several times. So it's like, oh, don't share needles. Okay, I'm done with you. Like, how can you re-engage people? How can you have several conversations? And you want to think about, like, well, what things do people like to listen to? Are there rumors you can tell people, or just some cool stuff that they can share? Or you can give them something so that they can actually have numerous conversations with folks. So thinking about what you want as a peer peer educator to influence their networks is you want them to continue to engage with those network members. All right, so measuring, as I said, indexes tend to change the most. The long-term outcomes, you can really tend to see a bigger change in behaviors. These RCT things are great, and I've done lots of them, but they take lots of resources. So you may want to think about other ways. Like, can you know, what I've seen sometimes now in interventions is, rather than an RTC, is what's the counterfactual? Like, we expect this amount of change or this amount of, you know, HIV rate or something in the community without this intervention. Then we'll do the intervention. Did we have, are we different from what that counterfactual is? So it seems like there's getting to be a little more acceptance of other types of designs besides RCTs. Okay, our nemesis, or why we do networks, because diffusion is great and contamination, you know, is the skunk at the tea party. First of all, with contamination, there's different ways to measure it. One way to measure it is you have things unique to your intervention that we call tracers that are only from your intervention. That if you see it in the control condition, you know there's contamination. So think about a training, something, a logo, something that if somebody says, yeah, I've seen it, that you know it came from the intervention. The only trouble with that is, you know, you could have a Martian dancing on an elephant and people are like, yeah, I think I saw that. So what we do is we tend to have real logos from the intervention that we ask everybody if they've seen it, or some saying or something that we know came from the intervention, and then we have the sham ones as well for a baseline. So it's like, oh, did you see this? And yeah, and then the sham one, oh, did you see that? Yeah. So we sort of know what's the baseline of people just sort of thinking they saw something or seeing something similar to that. So that's one thing. So sort of measuring that contamination. The second thing is focusing your intervention so that people aren't engaged in as much contamination. So if you're having focus on people you know are in the experimental group, those network members that they know are in that you know are in the experimental group. It's like, okay, can you do your outreach with these people, or can you do your peer education here, so that there's less contamination. And then the third thing is analyze it. So you can analyze a group that didn't get contamination, a group that got contamination, and the control groups, and then your experimental group. So you sort of have these three groups when you're doing that analysis. You can also do some, you know, more dose response of contamination as well if you're measuring it that way. But I think, again, you know, you really want to measure your contamination. Other ways to measure contamination, obviously, from a network perspective, is you get all your network inventories and you see, okay, were people network who were assigned to the experimental, like the indexes experimental network, were some of those also listed in some control group as well. So that's another way you can sort of look at potential for contamination. And clearly, you know, if you can do distance between groups, you know, if you have villages far away, you're going to have less contamination. But I think often it's not yes or no contamination. It's sort of the amount of contamination that you're getting between conditions. Sort of, that's great network interventions. What are some of our problems with them? Well, people, not only do they not always take kindly for you telling them what to do, but often relationships, there's a need for reciprocity. and especially like in caregiver interventions and other things, like people just don't want to get something, for free. It makes the relationship unbalanced. So how do you structure an intervention where the other person can give reciprocity? One thing we'll do in our interventions is have our peer educators express the other person's reciprocity of like, oh, you've always been really important to me. You've really helped me in the past. Now I'm going to do something that's maybe useful to you. So think about some of those basic social relationships that you might be violating. But the other thing is with telling people what to do, that especially about their health behaviors, that can lead to conflict. Nobody wants to be told take their medicines or this and that. So you have to figure out how can you do these in ways that are not going to lead to conflict. And the third thing I mentioned before is peer educators who are working with their networks. They can feel threatened by their role or like, what are you doing? So they'll try to very much impute people's credibility. So you need to figure out a way of maintaining their credibility. Okay, quickly, just to give you data because you'd feel cheated if this performance was data-free. So here's the randomized clinical trials, 6 sessions, equal attention group, evaluated up to 30 months, sorry. This is a study. We've done several of these. This was one done in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and the exotic other place of Philadelphia. So this is a network intervention where we train the indexes to go out to their networks. We've got the network members in before, pre-post, afterwards, and followed them for a mere 30 months. One good thing about this study in Philadelphia is the facilitators were not very good. And at first I was like, oh God, these people are not really good. But then it's like when you look from like implementation science, it's like, oh, these are your average facilitators who would be at a community center. So it's like, okay, there's pros and cons of that. So conversations, I don't really like odds ratios. I think they often like exaggerate them. You can have an odds ratio of 5 and it really, that variance or the relative risk you explain can be really little, especially if you have low prevalence of things. But us public health people love these things. So again, publish your odds ratio in public health journals. So we're like, okay, did the experimentals compare to the controls? Was there more conversations about HIV-related behavior? Yes, and in fact, 10 or more conversations. So it's higher in this was like 5 or more higher, was it? Okay, sorry I didn't put. This is the one you should look at. It was much better in Thailand. Oh, in Thailand, we had 0 outcomes because they had a war on drugs, which became a war on drug users, which was due to, because people started, for decades people had been using methamphetamines, but they had been orally ingesting it, and then they started smoking, and it was not a pretty scene because of that. But then injectors were visibly drug users and stigmatized, so they're the ones who got arrested. So it was just the intervention in Thailand, yeah, there was really no effect because of it. But here's the Philadelphia results from, and this is up to 30 months that we collected data. It wasn't powered enough to look at zero incidence as an outcome, but you see 6-session interventions. Only the index person gets trained. the outcomes are measured on both the index and their network members, so everybody. The main thing I wanted to show was that the social norms predicted whether or not people would in fact change their behaviors. They're a very strong predictor of the outcomes. And let's see. Oh, yeah, so even in this model where you include a baseline social norms and a follow-up social norms, and then you look 6 months later, both of these things predict, at least with the cookers, the follow-up social norms. In a multivariable logistic model, including both, it didn't seem that just the baseline ones were important, but also the follow-up ones predicted needle sharing. And what was interesting to see too was that it wasn't just norms predicted the behavior, but if you looked at the behaviors, then they predict the subsequent wave of social norms. So it seemed to be that there was this back and forth, so that you change the norms that change the behaviors, which change the norms. So you can't probably just have an intervention where all you do is change the norms, and if the behavior has to change or the norms aren't going to maintain a change. So just quickly going along, we did something similar. This was in Ukraine, and you can see, a substantial difference between zero incidents, same sort of successions between experimental and control networks in Ukraine for people who inject drugs. Just sort of wrapping things up, social support, it's not always great. Changing behaviors can sort of shake up relationships. Again, as I said, so specific network factors are linked to certain health outcomes. And sort of, what do you really want to change? Do you want to change the networks, the norms, the behaviors? What do you really want to focus on in these interventions? Impediments for these, we found like a lot of people, life events impede them from engaging in these. They have competing demands and lacks of resources. If you're trying to look structurally, the people who are most central may or may not be the ones who are interested in your intervention. There may be role conflict between you as being trained in this role and your community. We have no control over the messages that people give out in the community. What happens when the program ends? Let me just think. I don't think any of this. What do you need to keep people credible? Which ties should you focus on? I think that's probably. I'm going to just get the last slide here. Is it ethical to not only collect information, but muck up in the social environment and train people to give messages that you don't have control, and those people didn't come in your study, and you're changing behaviors in communities where those people didn't sign any informed consent. And then finally, just the networks we construct are not the way people construct their social networks. So think about that when you're designing your interventions as well. So try to race through.
Pearl, that's perfect. Thank you. Questions, comments? Carl?
Yeah.
I just kind of want to say I think it's an incredibly interesting area to funnel research into unintended consequences of interventions, right? About perhaps going to change behavior, but ultimately network fragmentation, right? I mean, there's so many unknowns. There's so many hypotheticals, and like having a great idea about your intervention process, the diffusion processes you're trying to aim,
I think we're uncomfortable about telling people to break ties. But what if your network member says, no, I'm not going to, I'm going to continue to engage in these high-risk things. Sorry. Well, so I think, there's sort of an ethical question, but also what do we advise them to do in those relationships? And we want to think ties are always supportive when they can be promoting problematic behavior as well. So it does seem like we're like tentative of going down that path. Yeah. Sorry.
Change the norms that will then change the behaviors? Like, is there necessarily?
Well, I'd say that since there's competing norms, if you can make one norm more salient and make it more acceptable even to talk about that. So if you get the people saying, I'm doing this, people like, oh, well, I guess that's the norm. So maybe there wasn't a difference, but just making that becoming more observable in the environment may make it so that people think, oh, that is a norm. But not being naive to thinking, oh, there aren't counteracting norms. Like with alcohol, parental norms are often very different than kids' norms. So how do you, navigate that? And also, one question about it's like, do you give positive messages, or do you like, oh, wow, look, that person really messed up because they were drinking and this happened? Or aren't we all happy and healthy not drinking? So I think some of that negative ties, negative messages, I don't think we really know enough about which ones are more impactful and which ones are really ethical to sort of promote in different contexts. Question?
I was wondering about you haven't talked about power dynamics and changes that happen when you want intervention and when you give control to this peer entities or that they are then conceived because of closeness to the researcher or having more information like would that end up balancing out later to change their role within the community? We know that we members play different roles. And that a little bit of like elevation in their role means that their role expectations of their role are changed across multiple things. So in my experience, like people that would bring education, that are getting calls about rental support, diverse access, all kinds of things. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that. And the second part of the last question is that usually having to also spend on prevention of burnout, like helping you spend minutes with your community until those minutes are perceived by community members who suddenly say, oh, you pay yourself fast, and now you're not going to pick up my calls at the end because you're involved in.
Okay, super quickly, like for power dynamics, there's a bunch of different levels. As researchers, we infuse power. But sometimes it's like, okay, HIV is something your community, we think you should care about. The downside is maybe resources go to that and don't go to other communicable and infectious diseases. So there's that power dynamic. There's, I think, constructing the role of you're not an expert in everything. How do you tell people, I don't know anything. I could get you, maybe link you to people who might know this, but this is not something I have expertise in. So I think really shaping that role so they're not, the local god. So that, it's important. We also have to think of like what happens after this intervention. Like, okay, you've given somebody this role, how does it sustain? So I think like here's what the peer education role is. It does this and this, but it doesn't do this and this. But also people might like at first they calling them and saying, okay, should my kid's name be or whatever. They may feel like that, but then they may be overwhelmed with that. So I think, again, it's those unintended consequences of changing things and knowing enough that you can put some boundaries, guardrails on that, but also ensuring that it's adaptable and ideally sustainable by the community, not by outsiders. Jim.
Last question is, curious if you or any of anyone that knows these interventions have gone back 10 years later, 20 years later, your indexes and ask, do we have that data?
I have anecdotal people who come back to our clinic in Baltimore and it's like, oh, I really like this, or this is what these things did for me. So I think that's totally biased to positive things that people come and say to us. So I don't think it's a fair representation, but it does seem like for some people it changes the trajectory, but it seems like, yeah, you'd really want to figure out, okay, which of the people sort of drop back to their prior state, which ones have sort of come to a new either place in their network or a new social role in the community.
Someone should do this. I think you go find this data. You have to go back and get all that. I'm picking up now. It's found like 90 authors and things like this. So you have to go find that data to go back and do it.
Well, I also think for a lot of our populations in the U.S. that we study who are disenfranchised, we've cut them off of so many positive roles of full employment, of marriage, of getting resources. So in some ways, we're making up because society has sort of said, oh, these roles are no longer available for you.
So that from it. All what the empirical knowledge was there, the experimental piece there that I always struggle with that really help us all do this work.
All right, thank you so much.